I'm Allison. I'm from GameAnalytics. I'm American, but I lived here in Denmark for 10 years or so. It's a great place. I agree on these dynamics are really fun to get to know. I've moved recently to beautiful Lole, Portugal, which is here. Please come and say hello sometime if you're in southern Portugal. My career has been in data and games and kind of this intersection of the two, both working at studios themselves. So you can see here some of the games, including the local Movie Star Planet. But then I've also worked for tech and service providers as well. So this is my second time around for GameAnalytics, and I've been here for 3 years now as their COO. So today, I know it's a LiveOps track, but when I think of these data in general, I always have to kind of drumbeat the whole picture all the way from ideation through LiveOps. So today I just want to paint this picture of how you can use data in these different phases of game development. They're not really linear. Of course, you start with your ideation, and then you start this testing and analyzing and optimizing phase. This happens before launch and goes all the way through your post-launch, and then your live operations and segmentation piece we'll talk about towards the end. So we'll get into each of these in a moment. In terms of being data-driven, there's a couple of core benefits of it that I think about, that I think are something that really drive me in this space. The first one is accelerating your decision-making. So data itself isn't going to make the decision for you. You can have a lot of numbers coming in. I was talking with someone today from Triband. You might have a lot of data coming at you, but what you need to be doing is analyzing it, looking at it, and then making those decisions based off of it. So the data is not going to do it itself. It is an active process that you need to take. But if you are doing it, the benefit of that is that it just speeds you up. It tells you, gives you some direction of where you should be going. The second benefit is then that we're all trying to make great games. I think that that's also part of the ethos of this industry, that we're trying to make great games, whether they're hyper-casual games or very deep games like Deep Rock Galactic. We're trying to make these wonderful experiences for our players. So you can do that through this data analysis process. So just to get into the different phases then. Ideation. At this point, you're trying to validate against the market and trying to understand your competitors. So identifying the preferences of your intended player base at this stage. You're looking for maybe some underserved niches or areas of rising demand when you have a game idea in the back of your mind. The competitive intelligence side is just determining who are my direct competitors who are out there and what are they doing to succeed in the market. So I wanted to maybe paint a little more visceral of a picture in terms of ideation. This is a game that Scott, who's my husband, and I have played a lot. This is called Word Snatch. Early on in our dating life cycle, we played this. We competed super hard. And I've been trying for the last 20 years to get him to make me this game. There's a couple of them out there. There's Word Snatch. This is an iPad version, and then there's a mobile version as well. So I wanted to use this one as a way to give you an idea of this ideation phase. So I'm diving in here to Market IQ, which is a tool that we just launched. This is an ad and competitive market data platform. But of course, there's others out there. What I wanted to look at specifically are word games and their downloads. And I found 3 things related to Word Snatch. One, in terms of primary mechanics, the word builder mechanic is most popular. This is where you have the tiles of letters and you're trying to just create games in the first place versus maybe looking for words within a crossword search or word search, for example. There are maybe 2 popular themes in word games. One is relaxation, the other is competition. They're really balanced between the two. There's a few other themes that were much lower down on the download charts, like family or specific languages, specific cultural elements to them. So word games really focus on this Zen gameplay or competition. And then maybe most importantly, because Word Snatch is 2-player, like you kind of have to have another person that you're competing against to play it, that there are very few 2-player word games that are out there. So at first I thought, well, maybe that's a good thing, that there's some space in the market for a 2-player game. But actually, the 2 main competitors here are Words with Friends, which is a long-term franchise from Zynga, and then Scrabble Go, which came out from Scopely. So maybe the competition's a little steep. These two are also word builder games as well. So the next thing I did was layer on revenue to downloads. I took the market share for all like the top 500 games in terms of their downloads, and then in terms of revenue, I isolated it to the top 30 here. You can see Scrabble Go fits here. I essentially wanted to see if revenue, like the two-player mode, if it gave a like a lift in terms of their revenue potential, and I think the answer is no, because you see Scrabble Go here, this is Words with Friends 2, and they're kind of in the fray in terms of how much revenue share that they're getting, and also download share. The red ones here are also these word builders, so you can see it doesn't differentiate them from word builders either in terms of this special gameplay. One thing I didn't do was look at revenue or downloads over time, so that would be a way to detect if this genre is rising or declining in terms of demand. I didn't do that in this, I was just looking at a snapshot. Another angle to look at in terms of competitive data is around the amount of advertising that these competitors are doing, and then the specific advertisements that they're using as well. What I found for both of these two games is that they're advertised a lot. They're in the top 20 most promoted word games, so they're very heavily advertised. One thing that was interesting was that the number of downloads that they get compared to the amount of advertising they're doing, when I looked at that ratio, it was actually much lower. So they do a lot of advertising, but they don't get as many downloads as their competitors do. I think this is likely because they're retargeting. The games have been out for some time, they've already got the downloads, and they're just trying to retarget those users and get them in. The other piece on this is just what messaging were they using in the first place. You can see Scrabble Go does talk about this two-player mode all the time. They say in pretty much all of their ads, it's playing against friends. That's the main benefit of coming in to do it. Whereas this surprised me a little bit with Words with Friends too, that they talk about the two-player mode, but what they actually talk more about is that they have all of these different modes for playing. So yeah, this is a little bit of data that you can look at pre-launch. I haven't made a game yet. No code has been written as far as I know. Maybe for Christmas we'll get a surprise in my stocking. But yeah, just to say that this is using some data at the very early stages. There's other methods as well, which I know there are a lot of experts here in the room and maybe in the other room in terms of running UA campaigns before your games go out the door, trying to understand the marketability of these early stages. Sometimes people do this before a game is even created. The community building aspect, again, Deep Rock is a really great example of that, just trying to build community before your game goes out so that you can start getting their feedback and their data. And then, of course, playtesting as well in the early stages. Playtesting gets into our next topic in terms of this iteration cycle as well. So we can move into that. I think we all know that games are not static. They're very dynamic systems. There's a lot of competing and complementary elements to them in terms of the gameplay, the monetization mechanics, the progression, the in-game economies. All of these things are moving all of the time. So it's very rare for getting it right in the beginning. And then as you update the game and make changes and new players come in, it's rare to get it right once all of that is happening as well. So this cycle, of course, is a standard, product development cycle where you're testing, you're analyzing with what data you have on hand, and then you optimize and do it again. I think if you're on this track, you know this cycle very viscerally. I want to break down the analysis that you can be doing into two specific things, because I think, again, once you have data flowing and coming at you, it's a big workload, if you will. It's kind of like a pipeline of data and all of these insights coming to you. So I like to break down the analysis that you can do into two categories. The first one being observation. This is simply looking at the trends in your data, trying to uncover some patterns. Of course, you need the data to be wrapped up into some KPIs, so getting those SQL queries going or using a system like GameAnalytics so that you have those trends to look at is maybe a very, very first step. But this observation, I think you can get a lot out of. Like, you can really understand what is happening with my drop-off points. Is that drop-off point impacted by, I'll click through. Is that drop-off point impacted by difficulty, or is that drop-off point impacted by just not having enough information about the game? So your observation point is around, again, looking at this data and then trying to come up with some hypotheses for testing. And that's when testing, like proper A/B testing, comes into play. A/B testing is a little bit of a sticking point for me, if you know me, in that I think it is great. I think you can get a lot of insights from it, but I also think it can be complicated and sometimes lead you down the right path, or down the wrong path. You really need to have set up your tests in a way where you're going to have a big change, because these little tiny changes when you're running tests might not be significant enough for you to take action on. I would guess at King there was a ton of this, actually, of this ongoing testing. Again, we're talking about this iteration phase. You'd started before you launch, and you're preparing to get your game out the door. And I just want to note that you need to be balancing your viability signals, like what you're seeing in the data, with time to market and budget as well. You can definitely, this is my, like, don't get into analysis paralysis. At some point, I think I was hearing someone just now saying, we know we launched this game and it wasn't quite ready. Like, we knew that. And so you are going to hit that point likely, and you're always kind of making the trade-off between these three things in this process. The next slides have a lot of detail to them, so if you would like me to send these to you, I would be happy to do that. They are meant to serve as a bit of inspiration around these three core areas where you can be testing, learning, and optimizing. The main one here being acquisition, but there's engagement and monetization on my next slides. Acquisition is all about maybe this other room, but optimizing your advertising, optimizing the cadence of the ads that you're doing with your game, and then identifying the high-performing advertising channels as well. So a lot of detail is happening over there about this. Engagement-wise, more related to this core group, I would say, related to the core features of the game and operating it on an ongoing basis. This is to try to strike the right balance with your gameplay, with your first-time user experience, balancing all of the difficulty, balancing your in-game economy. I wanted to just dump a bunch of kind of KPIs and things that you can start looking at in data, again, for inspiration, and give some ideas of what you could be optimizing based on these things as well. And again, this is a moving target for sure as your game is live and moving forward.
What's NUR
NUR is new user return rates, current user return rates, and returning user return rates, in that they haven't played for some period of time. So you can look at your DAU by how many are new that day, how many played in the last week, how many haven't played for the last week but played in the last month. In terms of the monetization piece, this is about, where's your money coming from in the first place. At a high level, it's looking at the different revenue sources you have, like in-app purchase, your advertising revenue that's coming in the door, maybe your subscription revenue, just where is all of it coming from, and then diving in a little bit deeper into exactly what you have for purchases, what are your price points, how do I optimize my offers and my bundles, optimizing your web shop engagement if you use a web shop, so trying to get your players out to a web shop to make their purchases there is a whole other activity that you can optimize in the monetization phase. I do want to say, I don't have it listed here, but your in-game economy, if you have one, that is really what's driving your in-app purchases most likely. So that is something to really dive into, this balancing of your in-game economies, particularly for free-to-play titles. This is a case study from Paradoxum. If you know them, they are a Roblox developer. They have a game called Tower Defense Simulator. They released this as a student project in 2019. A lot of Roblox games are student projects or young kids just getting started on this platform, so it's super interesting to see them, that they put out a game, it has wild success, and then they kind of go, oh, what do I do now? They maybe start putting some new content in, but they have to quickly learn this process of using data to balance your engagement, balance your monetization. And these guys were really struggling until they put game analytics in, have to say. I wanted to just give a couple of examples of optimizations that they did. They were looking at win-loss ratios, their losses by waves, win and loss counts per user, so all of these things in terms of difficulty. And what they found were that some waves were too easy, but then some were way too difficult. So they kind of brought everything to the middle, if you will, in their adjustments of game modes. They also did some heat map tracking through our custom fields or custom data. They pulled that out and then layered it onto their maps to see where the tower placements were happening. What they found with this is that players were putting towers in the same place on almost every map. It was kind of like you opened a map and you went boom, 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 and you were done over and over and over again. So what they needed to do was redesign the maps for more strategic placement of these towers. The last one being the tutorial steps. They saw some drop-offs, particularly at this demo man selected. I'm not sure what that is, actually. Interestingly, they both had to adjust the tutorial itself, like the instructions that they were giving to players to move through. But then they realized that once the tutorial was done, there was a huge gap in time before the player was put into an actual gameplay. So they decreased that time quite a bit so that they could be dumped right into real gameplay. I thought that one was interesting. So getting into maybe the LiveOps phase. So your game has launched. This is solidly, your game is out the door. LiveOps is an ongoing effort to do this optimization. You want to be sustaining your engagement, maximizing your retention, adapting your game based on player behaviors. I think we can all agree that not everybody in this room is the same, not everyone in the world is the same, so certain incentives that you might have in your gameplay are not necessarily going to work for everybody. And I think Words with Friends is a great example here. This is what Words with Friends look like at the beginning. This is their version 1. They have one gameplay mode. It's pretty simple. I think this is Words with Friends 2 with a lot of different modes. They must have been doing some testing, some understanding that players were coming into Words with Friends but didn't have the type of gameplay or the exact mode that they wanted. So they bundled all of that up with Words with Friends 2 and launched an additional game. Segmentation with LiveOps is kind of the key analysis method. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like exactly, but it's about narrowing into particular groups and segments within your gameplay. And then instead of looking at trends in data and kind of these patterns in data, it's more about looking at distributions of gameplay. So what's a highly engaged user, but at the same time, what's a low engaged user, and what are they each doing? Player segment examples are pretty much twofold as well. You can group your players by engagement and monetization. Here we go. You can also segment by country, by psychographics, these types of things as well, but those are signals that are a little bit harder to get or a little bit less interesting to look at. I think largely gameplay and player behavior is the same even across geos. I used to launch games in China, and it worked. It was the same exact game in the West and the East, and players were able to pick up on it. Of course, there's more fine-tuning that you can do, maybe with your UI, languages, things like that, when you're wanting to look at different geos. But when I think of player segmentation and really the LiveOps process for your game, it's around engagement and monetization in the bigger groups. Segments you might look at on engagement are the frequency, how much are they playing, how often. I want to talk specifically about feature engagement because this is a lot of different things for your game. So it can be things like missions, preferences for certain game modes like we saw with Words with Friends. Maybe they're highly engaged in a particular feature, or maybe they're not engaging in something as well. The example I have here is a VR game, which is it's called Drunken Bar Fight. I've told this story a few times, but what they had was a lot of different weapons that they were spending a lot of time developing. And then they realized when they started to look that there was many of their players that didn't use weapons at all. And so they went through and tried to figure out, okay, what do these non-weapon players want in the first place? And so they started to create different environments that they could do their drunken bar fighting in. So just an example of kind of looking at engagement and what they're playing with. For monetization, I wanted to point out just the purchase drivers as well. This, again, is things like your in-game economy, so the wallet size that players have and observing that and kind of where how much money players are holding. Participating in limited time events, making these purchases over and over and over again. Sometimes you have high spending players, sometimes you have low spending. There's many ways to cut monetization. I did take a little walk down memory lane in terms of, I got distracted making this presentation because I started looking at some old work examples I had. And that was super fun to see, was that clever or not back in the day. But something that struck me as I was looking at these examples is that I often hear with segmentation that you should be looking at your high value users and you should be making more for those players that are spending the most or spending the most time in your game. But I also think it's interesting to look at the low value users as well. This was a game, it was a hidden object game that was being developed with PopCap in early stages. We looked at the return rates by monetization status, and PopCap had a few different hidden object games in their portfolio, so we could compare game over game. What we saw with the game that was in testing, which is this one, is that their non-monetizers were not coming back into the game. So you pretty much had to spend money to enjoy the gameplay experience. Game 2 and Game 3 were two other ones that were a bit more balanced. This one had some special sales that would happen, so your monetizers would show up 3 times a month, for example. But what the game team did here was try to go back and look at their game and say, what can we add in for free? And that wasn't necessarily like, here's your free path, here's your monetization path, but balancing some of the coin drops, for example, so they would have more coins to be able to spend on each level, or maybe they had the power up that they needed to move forward. So I would say something here is that these guys would just go away. So you don't want to have only monetizers in your game because then you have nobody to try to make more money from in the future. The other thing I was looking at was this one. It's the same game, the same hidden object game, looking at low spenders versus high spenders. The lowest tier of spenders, and this was interesting, I felt like, we're largely spending on the starter pack and we're not buying coins. We saw then the skins and power-ups getting a little bit more popular here, coins becoming more popular. As they're spending more, what they were spending money on is coins in general, and you can see that particularly with the high spenders. What that did and what we started thinking about was just the pressure on the economy in terms of all of these purchase coins coming in, and was there enough content for them to spend these things down? Also thinking of the other pieces in terms of skins and power-ups that they kind of capped out in terms of how much content they could purchase. So your high spenders had already bought everything, and so that also put pressure or added some inspiration to be adding more of these types of content in the game. So yeah. Again, I wanted to just express kind of these 3 different areas of using data in your game. It really is a strategy to integrate into the processes that you have at your studio. Maybe you're already doing this, and if that is the case, I hope you were inspired maybe by a new methodology or a new way of looking at one of these areas. If you haven't yet started yet, maybe it will inspire you to get started with a little bit of analysis as well. I do hope it supports your decision making so that we, as Denmark, can get great games out the door. I think we have a lot of creativity here, and it's about then operating these games once they're live. Yeah, I hope to speak with each of you too about where you're at on your data journey, as we're here throughout the day. But I thank you for being here, and we'll take any questions if you have them.